So good evening, everyone. My name is Boris Worm. I'm speaking on behalf of the committee that selects a speaker for the annual Ransom A. Myers Lecture in Science and Society. And we're striving every year to select an individual, typically a public figure, who has had significant impact on our thinking, both in terms of science, but also in terms of what this means for wider society. And we had a wide range of speakers so far. Not just scientists, also communicators and advocates and conservationists. And today we're actually having an individual who combines all of these traits. Before I talk about Carl Safina, I'd like to take a minute to commemorate Ransom Myers, who this lecture is named after and whose life we're celebrating here today. So Ram was one of a kind. This is a phrase that's often used, but in this case, everybody who knew him knows he basically defined that phrase. He was a prodigious child, and even in high school was into elemental physics, won prizes, won scholarships to study physics, mathematics, and later biology. And he's best known for his many contributions to fisheries science and fisheries ecology. First of all, understanding through mathematical means the very workings of fish populations and their ability to sustain harvest, but then also documenting the bad job we're doing at managing these populations and becoming more and more outspoken about the ecosystem effects of overfishing and other abuses of the marine environment. But beside being a groundbreaking scientist and an inspiring mentor for many other scientists, he was also an incredibly passionate and warm individual with a big heart, particularly for children, but also for all things human. And he was a great lover of nature, an enthusiastic traveler, and really a great naturalist as well. And he died quite suddenly in 2007, and his friends and family got together to form this lecture as an annual event to commemorate his wonderful life. Here's Ram speaking out in typical fashion against high seas dragging as an example. As a celebration, we've been organizing the Ransom A. Myers Lecture. This is the 8th installment of it. Here are some of the other speakers we had: Andy Rosenberg, Andrew Weaver, Nancy Barron, David Schindler, Alexander Morton, Colin Roberts, and Donna Hurlburt last year. And they've all had very unique perspectives on science and the role it plays in shaping our understanding in society. And this year's speaker, Carl Safina, adds a new theme to this. Before I want to introduce Carl, I also like to mention that we're dedicating this particular event today not just to Ram's legacy, but also to the memory of Bill Friedman, who passed away after intense illness last Saturday. So I would like you to join me in applause for Bill and his life. Bill was also a member of our committee, a good friend of Ram, and I know that Ram personally admired him for his many contributions to conservation on the ground and for also being an incredibly generous and warm individual. Bill also taught at the biology department at Dalhousie University, much like Ram did. So that brings me to today's speaker, Carl Safina. And Carl Safina, like Ram and Bill, started out as an ecologist, really being interested in a deep look into nature and how different parts of nature interconnected, and understanding these interconnections and what they mean for our relationship to the natural world. Carl is a native of New York. He studied environmental science at New York University, then went on to do a master's in ecology at Rutgers, working mostly on seabirds, but also on raptors with a real passion for ornithology. In doing that work, though, and becoming very involved with the Audubon Society, he realized that maybe there's a greater impact to be had working in the policy arena. So he became a very active and well-known advocate for marine conservation, particularly the conservation of marine fish, which at that time in the late 80s and early 90s was something that not very many people were concerned about. And he really did groundbreaking work on drafting and inspiring early forms of the Magnuson-Stevens Act and making sure that that act gets passed, which is a really groundbreaking piece of legislation that calls for clear timelines and rebuilding targets for fish populations, bringing them back from the brink and making them productive again and healthy. And this is now enshrined in US legislation and forms a model for other nations around the world, unfortunately not yet Canada, to adopt similar targets and timelines for rebuilding fish populations to healthy levels. In doing this work and being exceptionally successful at it, though, he started writing. And he wrote this book, Song for the Blue Ocean, which is really a foundational book for marine conservation. I know I read it vacationing in Belize and looking out over the ocean, and the coral reefs he's writing about. He also wrote about bluefin tuna, about salmon, about many other species or ecosystems in trouble, in a way that really captured a broad global audience. He followed up with other books like Eye of the Albatross, The View from Lazy Point, and Voyage of the Turtle, which again took a very personal view to look at nature and animals through his very unique lens, capturing the attention of a wider and wider audience. His Voyage of the Turtle, which he actually worked on here in Nova Scotia, among other places. Today, he's going to give a talk inspired by his latest book, which just came out this year, Beyond Words, What Animals Think and Feel, which may be in some ways his most groundbreaking and maybe also most personal book. It was just reviewed yesterday in the New York Book Review and compared to books like The Origin of Species or Selfish Gene, which have really shaped and transformed our understanding and indeed our relationship with nature. So I'm very excited to have Carl here. He took a big detour from his travels from the West Coast, coming here just for us, back to the East Coast, flying back to Los Angeles tomorrow. A big effort, and we're very grateful to have you here, Carl. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be in my favorite country. Thanks for having me. As Boris mentioned, I was here in 2003 when I was working on this book. And Mike James, who is in the audience, I can't remember where I saw him sit there, he is, had me out, and I went out on a swordfish harpoon boat, and I got to meet Ram. I don't think it was the first time I met him, but I do remember we had a really beautiful visit down on the South Shore, and got to meet his lovely Italian wife, and it was a nice day. Hope you remember that. So, this is what we are going to talk about this evening, which after this whole introduction about me being an ocean person and a marine conservationist and an ocean-oriented ecologist is different than pretty much anything that I have worked on publicly before. But it's not so much for me a departure as it is a return to my original interest. My original interest was simply, what do animals do and why do they do it? I did not grow up in a place with many animals or even trees. I think I was probably 9 years old before I saw the first tree that was not planted by a human being. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, part of New York City. I lived for the first 10 years of my life in an apartment building. My father was a school teacher, and his hobby was raising canaries. So unlike everybody else that I knew, my apartment was full of bird song, and for some reason that no one can really explain, least of all me, I've just always really loved animals ever since I was born in a place with no animals for all practical purposes. We did have wild mammals. They were called cats. They roamed around the backyards and the alleys, and I could see gulls flying overhead. But as a very small child, I didn't know where the gulls were going or coming from, even though Brooklyn is really a coastal town, and they couldn't have been going more than 3 or 4 miles to water, but I was stuck in this concrete jungle not knowing any of that. I did, however, pester my father enough that by the time I was 7 years old, he caved into my demands that I get some homing pigeons, and we fixed up a shed in the backyard, and he got me first a pair of homing pigeons, and then I had a small flock, and I had those pigeons for about 4 years until we left the city and moved to the suburbs. Now, why this is, I think, important to me and my personal story is that long before I was ever introduced to any ideas about animals by anybody else, I was simply introduced to animals. And we set the pigeons up in this shed with these little cubicles, these little boxes that were stacked, and they had a partially barred off front with a little stoop and an opening and a nest. And the pairs lived in their boxes. Sometimes they would have little arguments. Sometimes they would have little feuds with other pairs. The adults would leave every day, and then they would come back, have dinner, and take care of their children. And across the yard, there was an apartment building in which human beings lived in little cubicles where they went out every day, came back, had dinner, and took care of their children. So it never occurred to me that other animals were very different from human animals. In fact, it occurred to me that we were all very similar. Since then, I have worked on a variety of animals in many places, and I've seen free-living animals on every continent in the world, and I've never seen anything that disabused me of my first impression, which is that we're pretty similar. So today, we're going to ask a question. The question is, does my pet really love me, or does she just want a treat? Of course, it's easy to see that our pet really loves us, right? It's easy to see. What is really going on in their furry little minds, in those little cute heads? Something is going on. Something is going on, but why is the question, do they love us? Why is it always everything about us? Why are we so narcissistic that even when we ask about them, we want to know about us? Why is that? So I have a different question that I came up with to ask them. Who are you? There are things that are capacities of the human mind. Are they capacities only of the human mind? Maybe. But there are other big brains out there. What are those big brains doing? Are they thinking and feeling? And how can we even begin to find a way in to those heads to try to answer that question? Well, I think there are some good ways in. We can look at their brains, we can consider evolution, and we can see what they do. First thing we have to remind ourselves, we who have named ourselves after our mental capacity, man the wise, not a very appropriate name since half of us are not man and many of us are not so wise, but anyway, we certainly have a high opinion of ourselves, but we have to understand foremost that our brain is inherited, that when evolution works, it uses the parts that are already in stock off the shelf before it fabricates the latest twist. The first nerves were in jellyfish. Our minds really came from the sea. Jellyfish gave rise to the first spinal cords. First spinal cords gave rise to the first vertebrates, and vertebrates came out on land and started to mess the place up. If you look at the nerves, the neurons of a fish, a turtle, a dog, or a person, they look essentially identical. The main difference is the overall product, how those nerves are networked, what those nerves do with one another. But there is a very, very fundamental similarity there. What are the implications for the experience of other creatures? It turns out that if you give a crayfish little electric shocks, you can induce anxiety that manifests in the fact that the crayfish will stop coming out of cover. It would become, I might say, afraid to come out. But if you give it the same drug that is used to treat anxiety disorder in humans, it relaxes and starts exploring again. If a dog has obsessive compulsive disorder and you give it the same drug that is used to treat OCD in people, it gets better. What does that have to say about their experiences, their perception and experiences? Do we celebrate the reduction and cure of anxiety in crayfish? No, mostly we just boil them. Octopuses use tools as well as do most apes, and they can identify individual human beings. Do we celebrate the ape-like intelligence of octopuses? Mostly, we boil them. When a grouper chases a small fish into a crevice, it will sometimes go to where it knows a moray eel is sleeping. It will signal the moray eel in a way that the eel understands, a signal that means, follow me. The moray eel will follow. The eel will go into the crevice that the grouper points to. Sometimes the eel will get the fish that's hiding there. Sometimes the fish will bolt, and the grouper will get it. This is a working partnership. It's been going on for a very, very long time, I assume, even though people have only found out about it in just the last few years. How do we celebrate this partnership? Mostly fried. A pattern is emerging about the capacity of certain minds, and it's mostly about ours. Sea otters use tools, and sea otters teach. Chimpanzees don't teach. Teaching is defined as one individual stops doing what it's actually doing and takes time to show another individual how to do something. Sea otters do that. Killer whales, there we go. Killer whales do that, and they also share food. They share most of the food that they catch. That's a very unusual thing. What are they thinking when they're sharing food? If you look at the human brain, you see that the human brain is an elaboration on earlier brains, and that this is something that we've inherited. If you look at the human brain compared to a chimpanzee brain, you see that basically we have a very large chimpanzee brain, and Well, okay, at least ours is larger so that we can reassure our insecure sense of our own superiority, but uh-oh, that is a dolphin brain. It has more convolutions and it's bigger. All right, well, you might be saying, well, that's just brains. But what about the human mind? Well, it turns out that you see the workings of a mind in the logic of behaviors. These elephants have found a shady patch under the palm trees to let the babies go to sleep while the adults rest and doze, but stay just vigilant enough in case anything threatens. You can tell that these elephants are resting and relaxed. Why can you tell that so instantly and so intuitively? Why does no one in the room think for one moment that the big ones have stomped the little ones to death and are preparing to eat them? Because they make sense of the world in the same way that we make sense of the world. They have the same imperatives. Keep your babies safe, stand guard, there's danger. Under the arc of the same sun, listening to the howls and whoops of the same predatory dangers, we became human. They have been our neighbors for a long time. No one would look at these elephants and say, oh, they're really relaxing. Obviously, they're concerned about something. You can see that immediately. What are they concerned about? It turns out, if you record the voices of tourists and you play those voices back through a hidden speaker, and you record the voices of herders who not infrequently hurt elephants around water holes in confrontations with livestock, you play their conversations through the same hidden speakers, the elephants will ignore the conversations of the tourists because tourists never bother them, and they will bunch up and run from the conversations of the herders. Elephants know about different kinds of human beings. They categorize us. They've been watching us for 100,000 years. We've been watching them since 1967. They know us better than we know them. They know who their friends are. They know who their enemies are. They know where they live. We have really the same imperatives. Keep our babies alive. Some of us are outfitted for hiking on land. Some of us are outfitted for diving. Mammals are all essentially the same. We have the same skeletons with the same bones. We have the same organs. We have the same basic brains. Our brains make the same chemicals that create mood and motivation. We see helping where help is appropriate. We see curiosity in the young. We see deep emotional bonds with family members. We recognize affection, whether in other mammals or birds, which are a little bit more distant from us in history. Dancing is dancing. We recognize courtship. And then we say, are they conscious? Why would we ask a question like that? Why isn't it so obvious? We actually ask whether animals with eyes and ears and noses use those things for seeing and hearing and smelling and have any sensation at all. I think it's very bizarre that we still are wondering about this. And consciousness is something that people seem very confused about. Some people think Consciousness is the ability to ponder your own death, or all these complicated things. When you get general anesthesia, it doesn't interrupt your ability to ponder your own death exactly, although it does, but it interrupts everything about your sensation of the world. You're either conscious or you're unconscious. Consciousness is your mental experience of awareness of sensations. They are absolutely conscious. It's ridiculous to think otherwise. I think of consciousness kind of like this. We have perceptions that are created in the brain, and they're basically based on information coming in through our senses. We sense, we have sensations. Those sensations are our perceptions, and then we might evaluate those perceptions. Let's say a spatial evaluation, or a predator seeing a potential prey animal coming and thinking that it has to wait until the right moment before it springs. Or we might have a mood response. We might feel sudden fright. We might suddenly feel drawn. Those things obviously influence one another as well. This is only a totally oversimplified schematic that I came up with. This is the merest reflection of reality. Everything is all working all together. And then either through our thinking or our emotions, we will often have the urge to do something. Even doing nothing is driven by an urge to do something. You have to decide whether to do nothing or something. All right, so that's kind of how I think about that. Many people think that certain things make us human, and many people think that empathy is what makes us human. If you start reading all the literature about animals, there seems to be an obsession among people who write about it to come up with the one thing that makes us human. And empathy is one of those things. People say empathy makes us human. But empathy is only the mind's ability to match your mood with the mood of your companions. That's basically what it is. Suddenly somebody is scared, you get scared. Somebody looks relaxed, you see somebody come up smiling, okay, you feel good. They put you in a good mood. So your mind matches them. And empathy is very important for many animals. Everything that lives in a group needs to be able to have some sense and read the mood of its companions. Why is that? Because if all of your companions suddenly startle and fly away, it really doesn't pay for you to be standing there saying, I wonder why everybody just left. So contagious fear is probably the deepest and oldest form of empathy. And then, like everything else in evolution, this has been elaborated upon over the course of time. Okay. So there's a few words missing on this slide. I will have to explain. We have basic empathy, which is feeling with another, as I just mentioned. And then we have what I call sympathy, which is you don't actually feel the same, but you feel for them. So I'm sorry that your grandmother just passed away. You don't feel that same level of grief, but you understand it. I call that sympathy. And then I call compassion action based on sympathy. So you have basic empathy, sympathy, and compassion. Sort of artificial categories that I came up with to express what I see as a range. Human empathy, far from being the thing that makes us human, is far from perfect, because we round up empathic creatures and we kill them and then we consume them. And you might reasonably, I will grant you, you might reasonably say, but that's just predation. And humans, among the things humans are, we are predators, and killing other species is what predators do. So I would say, yes, fair enough. but we're not so nice to people either. We don't have a lot of empathy a lot of the time. Many people and many science writers who seem to know only one thing about animal behavior know that you must never attribute human thoughts and human emotions to non-humans, which is called anthropomorphism. Everybody seems to know this very awkward word. And I am here to tell you that I think that attributing human thoughts and human emotions to other animals is the best first guess about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then you can watch and see if that makes more sense. It is not very scientific to say that they're hungry when they are eating, and that they are tired when their tongues are hanging out, and then when they are having fun and playing with their babies and acting joyful, say, we have no idea if they experience anything. That is not scientific, and it's a little bit weird. So I explained all of this stuff to a reporter, and the reporter said, okay, well, but how do you really know that other animals can think and feel? And immediately my mind rifled through the 50 pages of scientific references that are at the back of my book, and then I realized that actually the best answer was right in the room with me. Because when my dog gets up off the rug, comes over to me, not the couch, me, rolls over on her back and exposes her belly, she has had the thought, I would like my belly rubbed. I'm going to go to Carl because I know him and we're family. I know I can expose my belly because I trust him implicitly, and I know he can get the job done. And I know that when I roll over, he will understand what I'm asking for. She has shown that she has thought and she has felt. It's really not much more complicated than that. There are more complicated stories. For instance, a couple of days ago, I was at a conference, a film festival and conference on elephant conservation, and I was moderating a panel with the great elephant researcher, tremendously insightful woman, Cynthia Moss. And she showed a clip of a film where one elephant family, well, the basic unit of elephant society is the female family. It's the matriarch with her daughters and their children. So everybody's sisters and mother and sisters and daughters. So one family came and they forcibly drove off another family and captured an infant. And Cynthia said they didn't really want the baby. They wanted to show that other matriarch that they were more powerful and that they could do this if they wanted. Now, the other family happened to be spread out at the moment, and the family that drove off only 2 or 3 individuals of that family, including the matriarch. So the matriarch left. She went to find and rally together all the other members of their family, who were all spread out. They all came together because she called them. And then they went to the family that had just taken the baby, and like a wedge, they drove through that other family, pushed them off, and took their baby. Now, that is planning, organization, and execution. So there are lots of stories like this, but you do have to look for them, and you have to spend, in many cases, decades looking at animals to see these things suddenly fully show themselves. And for the vast, vast majority of animals in the world, nobody has looked at them as individuals for decades. We've done this only very recently and only for a small fraction of the animals in the world. We see animals like this and we say, oh, elephants, oh, killer whales. That's not how they see it. You see killer whales here? That's what you see, right? Killer whales? Well, it turns out that that male with the big fin, that's 36-year-old L22, and next to him is his sister, 42-year-old L36. They've been together for decades. They never leave each other. Killer whales, unlike any other animal, never leave their mothers. Males and females never leave their mothers. They know exactly who they are all the time. We just see, oh, killer whales. They know themselves as individuals. They recognize their own voices in the sea. They know where they are. They call each other back. They know what's going on. They have lives. That's an elephant that human beings named Philo. That's Philo 4 days later. Humans not only feel grief, we create a lot of it. We want to carve their teeth. Why can't we wait for them to die? African elephants once ranged from the Mediterranean all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope. In 1980, they still had a massive stronghold in Central and East Africa. Now, their range is in shards and splinters. That is the geography of the most magnificent creature on land being driven to total extinction. We in the United States do much better in our national parks. We killed every single wolf south of the Canadian border, and every single wolf in Yellowstone was killed by park rangers in the 1920s. Then 60 years later, we went to Canada and said, can you give us a few wolves? Our elk are out of control. So was born the most easily observable, most watched wolves in the world in Yellowstone National Park. And tourists began spending literally tens of millions of dollars a year to go to Yellowstone National Park just to watch the wolves. And this one, let's see if this is a pointer. Is this a pointer? This wolf is the alpha female of a pack. Now, a pack of wolves is a nuclear family. It has a breeding female and a breeding male and the children of 2 or 3 generations. And then as wolves get to be about 3 years old, they leave trying to find their own opportunity in life. Very, very much like us. This particular pack was unusual because this had 2 brothers in it. These 2 guys were brothers. So there were 3 leading adults. And then the young ones look to the adults for all the cues. Are we going to hunt now? Are we going to sleep now? Are we going to move to the next valley today? What are we going to do? They look to the adults. Domestic dogs are domesticated wolves, and they're kind of stuck psychologically at the 1-year-old stage. Instead of looking to their parents, they look to us for all the cues. And unlike wolves that eventually have to take charge of their own lives, our dogs never get to take charge of their own lives. That's a slight digression about dogs. The point is that these 3 wolves were the leading adults in a very stable pack family of wolves in Yellowstone Park, the most watched, most photographed wolves there, and that female was a really famous wolf. She was an incredible hunter, an incredible pack leader. All eyes were upon her. She's the only wolf in history to get her own obituary in the New York Times. And she got that obituary because one day in September of 2012, the Congress of the United States of America decided to take wolves off the endangered species list, and the state of Wyoming said it's open season, no limits on wolves. And they don't know that there's an imaginary line in the woods. And as the wolves outside the park started getting killed, they went near the park border. It was fall. Yellowstone Park is pretty, but it's not really great wildlife habitat because the winters are too brutal. So most of the hoofed animals leave in winter and they go down to lower elevations. This time, as their prey was going down, they followed. They found no resistance, and they left the park. And within a few days, he got killed. He got shot. They retreated back into the park. A few days later, they went back out. Maybe they were looking for him. Maybe they just went back because there had been a lot of prey there that they were following. Maybe they were just patrolling what they thought was an enlarging territory. Maybe it was all three of those things. She got shot. You see her research collar there? She got shot anyway. That's why she got an obituary in the New York Times. The rest of the family immediately descended into fighting. The father was out roaming, looking around for either his mate or a new mate, something. He had had a catastrophe. His mate and brother were gone. His daughters were all fighting with one another. This was the one most like her mother. She was the most precocious. She started attracting a lot of attention from two new males who came in to this vacuum. Her sisters kicked her out of the family. I watched that happen. It took a few days. She kept trying to come back. They wouldn't let her back into her family. She left and started roaming around. She left the park and she got shot. He, going into winter, the alpha male of one of the most stable and definitely the most observed family of wolves in Yellowstone Park, he lost his hunting support, his family, his mate, his territory. He had no place where he could safely be. He lost everything. If ever a wolf was set up to die, it was him. And somehow, incredibly, he managed to figure out how to survive, and he is still alive. It is now 3 years later. It took him until this year to get another mate and a territory and have pups again. So he now, again, after 3 years, has a pack. That's an incredible feat of survival for an animal that really needs help hunting, but he did it. We hurt them a lot. And the question is, why do they hurt us so little? And it starts to get a little bit mysterious here. This killer whale had just finished eating part of a gray whale that he and his family had killed. Those people in the boat had nothing to fear because no killer whale that is free-living has ever hurt a human being. This guy had just finished tearing a seal apart with two companions. Those people in the boat had nothing to fear, even though that seal weighed about as much as those people. And he could easily have smashed that boat. So they eat seals. Why don't they hurt us? Why can we trust them around our toddlers? There are a couple of really well-documented stories, including one by Alexandra Morton, of killer whales that researchers were following who were being a little bit elusive, and suddenly the researchers got completely enveloped in thick fog, were totally lost, and the killer whales came back to the boat. The researchers in both cases, Ken Balcom and Alexandra, decided, we'll follow the killer whales, we'll see where they lead us. And after a few miles, 15 miles in the case of Ken's story, they suddenly burst through the fog, and there was his house right on the shoreline, and then they turned around and left. That's pretty wild. There's a researcher in the Bahamas, Denise Herzing. She has these dolphins that know her. She's been studying them for years. She knows them individually. They know her individually. And when she shows up in the boat, they usually stay for a couple of weeks, and the dolphins come over and they bow ride and everything else. And one day, they just suddenly didn't want to come near the boat. And nobody could figure out what was going on until somebody discovered that one of the people on board had died during a nap in his bunk. Now, how in the world could the dolphins know that one of the human hearts had just stopped, and why would that spook them? That is really strange. In an aquarium in South Africa, there was a baby bottlenose dolphin, still nursing age, and one of the keepers at the aquarium was on a break, and he was down outside the tank looking through a big plate glass window while he was smoking. And the little baby dolphin, whose name was Dolly, swam over, looked at him for a little while, watched him smoking, went over to her mother, nursed for a few moments, came back to the window, opened her mouth, and let out a cloud of milk that enveloped her head like a cloud of smoke. Now, in human beings, when we use one thing to represent another thing, we call that art. Okay? What makes us human is not what we think. It's not what we like to think either. What makes us human is not that we sometimes have empathy or that we're conscious or some of these other things that are much more widespread. What makes us human is that we are the extreme animal. We are the most compassionate, most violent, most creative, and most destructive animal ever on the face of planet Earth. That's what makes us human. It's not love. We are not the only ones who care about our mates. We're not the only ones who care about our children. Albatrosses frequently fly 6,000 to 10,000 miles over weeks to come back and deliver one big meal to a chick that has been waiting for them. And they nest on the most remote islands in the world, including islands in the very middle of the world's biggest ocean. That's Laysan Island in the middle of the Pacific, and that's what it looks like. Into the sacred chain of being that literally passes life from one generation to the next is our plastic garbage that we, who constantly congratulate ourselves for thinking, don't ever think about. This chick was 6 months old and ready to fly and died, packed with red cigarette lighters. That's what those are. This is not the relationship we're supposed to have with the rest of the world. But this is not an idea. This is the relationship we do have with the rest of the world, because we, with our big brains, don't use our big brains to think about everything else that's here with us or the consequences. But when we welcome new children into the world, we welcome them into the company of other animals. We don't paint cell phones and work cubicles on the walls of nurseries. We paint animals. We say, look, we're not alone here. And all of the animals that are deemed worthy of salvation in every painting of Noah's Ark, they're all in mortal trouble now, and their flood is us. So I started with a question: do they love us? The question is, can we love them? enough to simply let them continue to be here with us? Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. That was very incredible. I'm sure there's a few questions for Carl. We'll have about 10, 15 minutes to answer questions. Please speak up and please keep reasonably brief to allow others to ask questions as well.
There's got to be at least one cat story out there.
I know I have a few.
Yes? So the question is there anything in animals that seems similarly illogical to what we see in humans? Did you read my book? No, okay. Well, that's interesting because that's one of the main points that I actually get to in the book, is that people have decided that humans are the rational animal, that this is the thing that makes us human. We are the rational animal. We are actually the only irrational animal. Every other animal is an absolute empiricist. They only believe what's actually there and what they see, and they're total realists. They only act on the things that really are right there. And we believe a lot of things for which there's actually no evidence, or it contradicts the way the world works. And a really good question is, why is that? Where in the world does that come from? I think there might be two possible answers, although this is definitely in the realm of who knows, but I think there might be two possible answers. One is that contagious fear is based on you not empirically checking to see if there's really danger there. It's based on better safe than sorry. Your friends obviously believe that they need to get out of there instantly. You don't check, you just go with them. And it might be that our belief in much more elaborate things that aren't there may come from the idea of better safe than sorry. If you are taught that if you don't do certain things, you will burn in hell forever, do those things. Who knows? The other possibility might be that irrationality is a byproduct of the capacity of the human mind to imagine what is not there and to create those things. In other words, it might be that our capacity for creativity depends on irrationality. What, after all, is more irrational than a piano concerto or a skyscraper or something like that, right? We imagine things and then we execute those plans. And that's pretty interesting, and it may be that our ability to imagine what's not there is part of our irrationality. But I think it's a very good question. Anybody have a cat story?
You're sounding like you're talking about Mr. Harper.
I was talking about Mr. Trump because I'm American. Yes?
Yes. Do you think animals experience time, and how do they experience it?
Do I think animals experience time, and how? Yeah, they definitely experience time. I think they experience time similarly to the way that tribal humans experience time, which is not too far into the future, plans that are more immediate. You know, they definitely, they know that time passes. They have a sense of the passage of the day. They often know or take subtle cues around them for certain things about time, things having to do with being active at certain times of day or at certain tides or things like that. And they often wait in anticipation for what they kind of expect to happen. But their time horizons are fairly short. You know, they're not planning where they're going to send their college submission, their college application submissions, or something that they're going to do in 2 or 3 years. But then again, neither are any tribal humans thinking about what they're going to do in 2 or 3 years. They have shorter imperatives. And I think that time for them is kind of circular, probably, perhaps, where it's mostly about the day, and possibly about the seasons. If they are experienced with seasonal migrations, they've already done one, they might have some sense of what's coming from their memory. So that's kind of how I think they do experience time in a way that is more immediate and more limited than we experience time. Yes?
So do you think then therefore that conceiving of the future is ultimately irrational? That's what it seems to do.
Do I think that conceiving of the future is irrational? No, well, no, the future keeps happening. So I would say that's fairly empirically derived, that we know the future will happen, and we know that there's a pretty good chance that we will be in part of it. And because we can talk, and talking in our way with the complexity of our language has allowed us to network all our minds together, not only across the landscape, but also through time. So we can talk to people about what has happened, and that's how we know that we are going to die at some point. And we can make plans, reasonably make plans for next year, but not for next century. And I think that we understand those things because we inform each other through our way of speaking. So I don't think any of that is intuitive at all. I think we know that we can expect it because we've been taught by language from other people's experience that we can expect it. And I think that wolves know that if they go to the next valley, they can expect to encounter that hostile other pack that they have experienced there before. And they know the lay of their territory. But again, tribal humans who are fully human, many of them never traveled more than about 10 miles in any direction because they were up against hostile competitors. So, as I read once in a book, no hunter's eye ever saw the end of the earth. But that's true. Like we would understand our territory, they understand their territory. In some cases, their territory is kind of limited, 10 or 20 miles. In others, it's really vast. Birds that migrate thousands of miles, for instance. So, yes?
So you mentioned earlier about how different families of elephants show superiority over another family by kidnapping their young.
That rarely happens, but that does happen occasionally. It's a show of dominance, basically.
Yeah. So is this possible with animals fully waging bloodshedding wars against each other? Or?
Do animals ever wage bloodshedding wars against each other? Well, some do and some don't. Chimpanzees do, and some colonial insects like ants do all the time. And so kind of an interesting thing is if you assume that ants don't think about it the way that we think about it, and that's much more automatic with them, which it might be, I don't know. I don't really know. I'm much more reluctant to guess what ants think. But then you have to say, well, if they live in groups and various evolutionary pressures have given them the capacity to seek and wage war, then what does that say about our ungovernable capacity to seek and wage war that we cannot seem to fully gain control of? And does that just come from ecological imperatives that we actually can't get a good grip on? Because we keep doing it, and we keep saying, like, the big dream of humanity is world peace, and we keep failing at that. So, but certain animals wage blood-shedding war, and many others wage tribal conflicts. Like elephants have these little shows of dominance from time to time, but they're mostly very peaceful. But many animals are very territorial, and many group animals are territorial with other groups. So wolves sometimes kill other members of other packs, and that's about as arbitrary as a lot of our fighting is, because it has to do with borders. A wolf that you might kill in another pack could just as easily come and join your pack if your alpha dies, or you might go and leave your parents and form a pack with that individual. But if your parents are fighting, you're going to fight with each other. It's just like Romeo and Juliet, and it's just as, in a sense, arbitrary. Not in a sense, it's just as arbitrary much of the time. Yes?
My question's actually quite related.
That's good. Otherwise, we wouldn't want to hear it.
With the exception of dominance and territorialism that we see in these animal conflicts, are there characteristics of just a menacing and just being bullies in the animal kingdom? Because I wonder then if perhaps the thing that makes us most human is just being mean for the sake of being mean.
Is just being mean for the sake of being mean the thing that makes us human? Well, like everything that we say makes us human and is the thing that makes us human, you can see examples of it with some other creatures. Chimpanzees are probably the best example where there is bullying, and the bullying is for about the same reason that really people bully, which is a show of dominance and a way to establish your own status as higher and better and giving yourself more behavioral latitude. I can do things you can't do. I'm better than you. I will put you in your place. And chimpanzees do that too. And it's a shame that the other species between the other current day great apes and us are all extinct, because we would see these things on a much smoother continuum, I think, if all those other species were still with us. There seems to be that gap there because there's a whole bunch of really key species in the close evolution to our behavior that aren't there anymore, some of which I think is our fault. Yes?
There seems to be a lot of argument about how intensely animals feel physical pain,
Yes.
which is the phrase that you were showing there.
Yes.
That they don't feel the same sense of pain as humans do.
Right. Yes. Is there some truth to the idea that they don't feel the same pain as a human would? Yeah, physical pain. Well, there's probably some truth to that. I think that at some level, probably some invertebrates don't feel physical pain as intensely as humans do, or perhaps a creature with a really hard shell doesn't need to have very sensitive sense of touch or dense pain receptors or things like that. I think the idea that other mammals don't feel physical pain as acutely as humans doesn't make any sense to me. I don't see why they wouldn't. And then This often comes up in the case of fish. Do fish feel pain when they get a hook slammed into their face? And my guess is that they probably don't, because they probably go into the same kind of sort of a shock-like response that humans do when we have a sudden physical trauma. Like I've often read that when people get an arm blown off, it doesn't hurt right away. And I've done a lot of fishing, and I once got a pretty big hook stuck in my foot, and I didn't even know it went in. I felt a tiny tap, and when I went to pick it up, I thought it was on the surface of my foot. I was shocked that the whole hook was stuck into my foot. I wound up going to the doctor. I once saw a guy with a big fishing lure with one of the hooks in his hand and blood running all over the place and a rag wrapped around it. And I said to him, "That looks really painful." And he said, "It's not hurting yet." So I think just based on how hard fish pull against that hook, my sense is they are panicked more than they are feeling pain in the moment, but I think they probably feel some pain, but they don't. A lot of fish are in a liquid environment where they don't explore in a tactile way. A lot of fish eat animals with spines and shells, so you really wouldn't want your mouth to be full of pain receptors. So I think that there are differences, but I think, like everything, I think it's on a scale. In the back, yes.
The consequences of your perspective on how we regard animals is maybe easier to see. What would be the consequences of how we regard one another?
Of how we regard one another.
What would be the way you're trying to help people?
Well, I'm going to turn that question around a little bit, because I think that if we know one another and we know that we each can feel empathy and pain and fear and despair and all that kind of stuff, how we should treat each other is blindingly obvious. But the sad fact is that what we say about animals now, that they don't have any empathy and they don't value their lives, is exactly what we have often said about other people when we first encountered them. We said that Africans cannot feel love, that Africans of all people have no sense of aesthetics, that Vietnamese don't value life. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie Hearts and Minds, where the US general in charge of the Vietnam War actually said that life is not valued by the Oriental. So our ability to deceive ourselves is one of the things that makes us human. And our ability to deceive ourselves so that we may inflict pain on creatures that we know very well have pain receptors, physical and emotional, is one of the worst things about us.
But Carl, do you see evidence that this relationship is changing? And if so, if our relationship is changing indeed, what drives that change in one or another direction?
Yeah, I think the relationship is changing. I mean, I think that these things that can be said about other people are, they're not acceptable anymore pretty much anywhere except on Fox News and in the Republican Party. And yes, exactly. And for the first time, well, not for the first time, starting in the 1700s, starting in the 1700s in the West, people started to question the idea about inflicting pain on other animals as a bad thing. The Hindus were onto this much longer time ago, and much more now than ever. You have a lot of people who are vegetarians, or people who are very selective about what meat they will and won't eat, and things like that. So I think it's changing, and I think it's changing because we are making some progress, and the geometry of human progress is an expanding circle of compassion. And every time that we deny or defer compassion or we create differences, we realize in retrospect what a hideous mistake we've made. And every time we expand our circle to include people of other races, people of other genders, people who are not exactly sure what gender they even want to be today, every time we include them and say, it's okay, we're all in the family, we always look back and say that that was the right thing to do. And every time we create a barrier and a wall and make excuses for treating others without any compassion or empathy, we eventually seem to realize that that was a mistake, sometimes a very hideous mistake. Yes?
You described consciousness as sort of the output of perceptions into thinking and emotion. Do you think that we sort of draw a line between ourselves and other animals because we're uncomfortable with that sort of deterministic way of seeing our own lives as opposed to something like free will?
Well, I don't actually fully understand your question.
So whereas, so like consciousness is just being like an input-output system. So like, your senses and your brain interpret those senses into your emotions and your thoughts. So that's sort of mathematical. Whereas,
No, well, I don't think it's mathematical. Well, the question is about consciousness, and me saying that consciousness is sort of an output function of your perceptions. Is that a fair way to characterize what you said?
so that would be the case with animals as well.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't like that because it's sort of like we don't have free will. We're just the sum of our preceding equations.
I don't really think it has anything to do with being afraid that that means we don't have free will, because the bottom thing there is you have motivations to act, and I actually think that consciousness I think it did arise when, in order to cope with the amount of variability around you, you needed to make decisions. I think that where life forces decisions, you have a need for consciousness. Now, this is you might call it a hypothesis or just a guess about that. But I did not mean to imply that I think that consciousness is an output function of perceptions exactly. What I meant to say is that consciousness is the experience of sensations. Consciousness is the thing that feels like something. If you feel something, you are conscious. A lot of our bodies, almost everything about us, happens with a total lack of consciousness. All the metabolism in all your cells, your digestion, your heart rate, even breathing, which is only consciously controllable but happens unconsciously if you're not paying attention or you're sleeping, all your growth, your immune system, your entire hormonal system, the internal aspects of reproduction, fetal development, everything like that, healing, and even a lot of mating behavior, which we don't think about too often, and we get into trouble by not thinking about it enough. But all of those things happen with a total lack of consciousness. And then on all of that is layered this piece that can experience something. Based on that experience of something, we make decisions. There are people who study this who insist that we actually make decisions unconsciously, and then after we've decided something, it gets sent to our consciousness, and we're aware of the decision that's made. And I think that's a stretch, because I know when you anguish over a decision, should I make or accept a proposal of marriage, that is not made in your unconscious, and then, because you're anguishing over a decision sometimes. So I think that consciousness is frequently directly involved in the need to sift things and make a decision. Should I wait for that animal to come farther down the path until I pounce? You need to evaluate some of those things consciously. So that's what I think. And a lot of this stuff is very hard to know for sure, but I've been thinking about it for a couple of years while I've been working on this. So I do have some opinions about it.
Sorry,
Yes.
I'm acutely conscious of time right now.
Oh.
And we have a bunch of people outside waiting with food and wine who are getting impatient, I think, and treading from one foot to another.
Oh,
but
okay.
there will be an opportunity to talk with Carl.
Okay.
Purchase
So
this book.
I saw some hands. I'll answer your questions outside, and
get it signed.
Yeah, and you can get my book signed.
We'll do that outside. Before we do that, though, I would like to thank Carl again for making a long and somewhat arduous journey out here. And as one token of appreciation, we've actually commissioned a painting from a local artist for you.
Impossible.
And this will be sent to you by Sophia Myers, daughter of Ram Myers.
That's incredible. Really? Wow. Well, I am capable of feeling emotion, I can tell you that right now. I can't believe how nice this is. Thank you so, so, so much. Well, that will have a place of honor in my home. Thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone for coming out on a rainy night. And please join us upstairs for some food and wine, and there's books for sale and an opportunity to talk to Carl.